Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to what I hope will be an enjoyable series to many people, although it may be of niche interest. Specifically, this series is transcribing the audiobooks of Douglas Adams' The Hitch-hiker's Guide to the Galaxy, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Life, the Universe and Everything, and So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, as read by Stephen Moore. Stephen Moore, for those who don't know, is the actor who played Marvin the Paranoid Android on the original radio production of The Hitch-hiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the TV series which followed soon after. This is the genuine Marvin the Paranoid Android, except no substitutes. When the radio series first aired in 1979, I was about 5 years old, and it was then repeated multiple times over several years on Radio 4, where it was first broadcast. My father was an avid fan of Hitch-hikers as soon as it was produced, had the books, which I still have copies of, and listened to the radio series repeatedly, as did I growing up, to the point where I think I overtook my father in terms of my fandom for the series and would insist that we listen to it whenever it was on a Saturday, usually around about lunchtime, and it just had to be on in the background so I could listen to it. Later, in school, having consumed the radio series multiple times and the books, I discovered the audiobooks in the school library, as read by Stephen Moore. And of course, I got these out and listened to them repeatedly as long as I could. Obviously, I had to take them back. They were, after all, library books on tape. Recently, I got to thinking about these books on tape and how enjoyable they were. Being read by Stephen Moore, it had the voice of Marvin the Paranoid Android whenever he read the Marvin lines, and of course, the correct voice for the other characters that he also read in the radio series. And simply as the narrator, he has an excellent reading voice. So I remembered how much I enjoyed those as a child and then thought, I wonder if they're still readily available. As it turns out, they are not. They have never been produced on CD or online. They only exist in that original tape form, and those tapes themselves are incredibly hard to find, as I discovered as I attempted to dig them out online from various shops and sources. I have now got all tapes available. I would like to stress, I do not own the copyright for these tapes. I do not own the copyright for the original material, and I'm recording them in these videos in an effort to preserve them because they are on magnetic tape. Magnetic tape degrades, and there aren't very many of them left around as far as I can see, and there's been no effort to reproduce these professionally in another format, either online, digitally, or even just on CD. So if you do own the copyright for these, please, by all means, copyright claim these videos as the material is your own, but I would request humbly that you do not block them, just monetize them. My channel isn't monetized, so I'm not going to make money from this anyway, but I would like people, future generations, to be able to access these amazing recordings and enjoy Stephen Moore's work long into the future. Anyway, enough about my motivations for doing this, and now here is So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, Cassette Side 1.
That evening it was dark early, which was normal for the time of year. It was cold and windy, which was normal. It started to rain, which was particularly normal. A spacecraft landed, which was not. There was nobody around to see it as it slipped down out of the clouds, seemingly balanced on a single beam of light. From a distance you would scarcely have noticed it through the lightning and the storm clouds, but seen from close to, it was strangely beautiful, a grey craft of elegantly sculpted form, quite small. The craft slid quietly down through the rain, its dim operating lights wrapping it in tasteful rainbows. It hummed very quietly, a hum which became gradually louder and deeper as it approached the ground, and which, at an altitude of 6 inches, became a heavy throb. At last it dropped and was quiet. A hatchway opened. A short flight of steps unfolded itself. A light appeared in the opening, a bright light streaming out into the wet night, and shadows moved within. A tall figure appeared in the light, looked around, flinched, and hurried down the steps, carrying a large shopping bag under its arm. It had large characters printed on the side which read, to anyone who could decipher the Centaurian alphabet, Duty-Free Mega Market, Port Bresta, Alpha Centauri. The figure turned and gave a single abrupt wave back to the ship. Already the rain was streaming through its hair. "Thank you," he called out. "Thank you very—" He was interrupted by a sharp crack of thunder. He glanced up apprehensively, hoisted the bag under his arm, and started to run for the shelter of some trees as, behind him, the spacecraft had already begun its ascent. Lightning flitted through the sky. He moved swiftly across the ground, slipping here and there, hunching himself against the rain which was falling now with ever-increasing concentration as if being pulled from the sky. His feet sloshed through the mud. Thunder grumbled over the hills. He pointlessly wiped the rain off his face and stumbled on. More lights. Not lightning this time, but more diffused and dimmer lights which played slowly over the horizon and faded. The figure paused again on seeing them and then redoubled his steps, making directly towards the point of the horizon at which they had appeared. And now the ground was becoming steeper, sloping upwards, and after another 200 or 300 yards it led at last to an obstacle. The figure paused to examine the barrier and then dropped the bag he was carrying over it before climbing over himself. Hardly had the figure touched the ground on the other side when there came sweeping out of the rain towards him a machine, light streaming through the wall of water. The figure pressed back as the machine streaked towards him. Rob McKenna was a miserable bastard, and he knew it because he'd had a lot of people pointed out to him over the years, and he saw no reason to disagree with them, except the obvious one, which was that he liked disagreeing with people, particularly people he disliked, which included, at the last count, everybody. He heaved a sigh and shoved down a gear. The hill was beginning to steepen, and his lorry was heavy with Danish thermostatic radiator controls. It wasn't that he was naturally predisposed to be so surly, at least he hoped not. It was just the rain which got him down. Always the rain. It was raining now. It was a particular type of rain that he particularly disliked, particularly when he was driving. He had a number for it. It was rain type 17. He had read somewhere that the Eskimos had over 200 different words for snow, without which their conversation would probably have got very monotonous. Rob McKenna had 231 different types of rain entered in his little book, and he didn't like any of them. He shifted down another gear, and the lorry heaved its revs up. Since he had left Denmark the previous afternoon, he'd been through types 33, light pricking drizzle which made the road slippery, 39, heavy spotting, 47 to 51, vertical light drizzle through to sharply slanting light to moderate drizzle freshening, 87 and 88, two finely distinguished varieties of vertical torrential downpour, all the sea storm types between 192 and 213 at once, 123, 124, 126, 127, mild and intermediate cold gusting, regular and syncopated cab drumming, 11, breezy droplets, and now, his least favourite of all, 17. Rain type 17 was a dirty blatter battering against his windscreen so hard that it didn't make much odds whether he had his wipers on or off. He pounded his steering wheel, kicked the floor, thumped his cassette player till it suddenly started playing Barry Manilow, thumped it again till it stopped, and swore. It was at the very moment that his fury was peaking that there loomed swimmingly in his headlights, hardly visible through the blatter, a figure by the roadside. A poor, bedraggled figure, strangely attired, wetter than an otter in a washing machine, and hitching. Poor miserable sod, thought Rob McKenna to himself, realizing that here was somebody with a better right to feel hard done by than himself. Must be chilled to the bone. Stupid to be out hitching on a filthy night like this. All you get is cold, wet, and lorries driving through puddles at you. He shook his head grimly, heaved another sigh, gave the wheel a turn, and hit a large sheet of water square on. See what I mean? He thought to himself as he ploughed swiftly through it. You get some right bastards on the road. Splattered in his rear mirror a couple of seconds later was the reflection of the hitchhiker, drenched by the roadside. For a moment he felt good about this. Moment or two later he felt bad about feeling good about it. Then he felt good about feeling bad about feeling good about it, and, satisfied, drove on into the night. And as he drove on, the rain clouds dragged down the sky after him, for, though he did not know it, Rob McKenna was a rain god. All he knew was that his working days were miserable, and he had a succession of lousy holidays. All the clouds knew was that they loved him, and wanted to be near him, to cherish him, and to water him. The next two lorries were not driven by rain gods, but they did exactly the same thing. The figure trudged, or rather sloshed, onwards till the hill resumed and the treacherous sheet of water was left behind. After a while, The rain began to ease, and the moon put in a brief appearance from behind the clouds. The storm had now definitely abated, and what thunder there was now grumbled over more distant hills like a man saying, "And another thing," 20 minutes after admitting he'd lost the argument. The air was clearer now, the night cold. Sound travelled rather well. The lost figure, shivering desperately, presently reached a junction where a side road turned off to the left. Opposite the turning stood a signpost which the figure suddenly hurried to and studied with feverish curiosity, only twisting away from it as a car approached. A Saab drew to a halt beside him. Its window wound down, and a friendly voice said, "Have you come far?" The figure turned toward it. He stopped and grasped the handle of the door. Behind Arthur Dent in the back seat was a girl who had made him crack his head on the door as he climbed in. He didn't know if it was just because she was the first female of his own species that he'd laid eyes on in years, or what it was, but he felt stupefied. "This is absurd," he told himself. "Calm down. You are not," he continued to himself, "in a fit and rational state. You have just hitchhiked over 100,000 light-years across the galaxy. You are very tired, a little confused, and extremely vulnerable. Relax. Don't panic. Concentrate on breathing deeply." He twisted round in his seat. "Are you sure she's all right?" he said. Beyond the fact that she was, to him, heart-thumpingly beautiful, he could make out very little: how tall she was, how old she was, the exact shading of her hair, and nor could he ask her anything about herself because, sadly, she was completely unconscious. "She's just drugged," said her brother, shrugging, not moving his eyes from the road ahead. And that's all right, is it?" said Arthur in alarm. "Suits me," he said. "Ah," said Arthur. The conversation so far had been going astoundingly badly. After an initial flurry of opening hellos, he and Russell, the wonderful girl's brother's name was Russell, a name which to Arthur's mind always suggested burly men with blonde moustaches and blow-dried hair, had quickly discovered that they didn't like each other at all. Russell was a burly man. He had a blonde moustache. His hair was fine and blow-dried. "She's not a junkie," said Russell suddenly, as if he clearly thought that someone else in the car might be. "She's under sedation." "But that's terrible," said Arthur, twisting round to look at her again. She seemed to stir slightly, and her head slipped sideways on her shoulder. Her dark hair fell across her face, obscuring it. "What's the matter with her? Is she ill?" "No," said Russell, "merely barking mad." "What?" said Arthur, horrified. "Loopy. Completely bananas. I'm taking her back to the hospital and telling them to have another go. They let her out while she still thought she was a hedgehog." "A hedgehog?" "Well, maybe not a hedgehog, though it would probably be simpler to deal with if she did. If somebody thinks they're a hedgehog, presumably you just give them a mirror and a few pictures of hedgehogs and tell them to sort it out for themselves. At least medical science could deal with it, that's the point. Seems that's not good enough for Fenny, though." "Fenny? You know what I got her for Christmas? Black's Medical Dictionary. Nice present." "Yeah, I thought so. Thousands of diseases in it, all in alphabetical order. Take your pick," I said. "Anything here can be dealt with. The proper drugs can be prescribed. But no, she has to have something different, just to make life difficult. I mean, she was like that at school, you know." "Was she?" "She was. Fell over playing hockey and broke a bone nobody had ever heard of." "Well, I can see how that would be irritating," said Arthur doubtfully. He was rather disappointed to discover her name was Fenny. It was a rather silly, dispiriting name, such as an unlovely maiden aunt might vote herself if she couldn't sustain the name Fenella properly. "Well, not that I wasn't sympathetic," continued Russell, "but it did get a bit irritating. She was limping for months." He slowed down. "This is your turning, isn't it?" No," said Arthur. 5 miles further on, if that's all right." "Okay," said Russell, after a very tiny pause to indicate that it wasn't, and speeded up again. It was, in fact, Arthur's turning, but he couldn't leave without finding out something more about this girl who seemed to have taken such a grip on his mind without even waking up. He could take either of the next 2 turnings. They led back to the village that had been his home, though what he would find there he hesitated to imagine. By his own personal timescale, so far as he could estimate it, living as he had been under the alien rotations of distant suns, it was 8 years since he had left. But what time had passed here, he could hardly guess. Indeed, what events had passed were beyond his exhausted comprehension, because this planet, his home, should not be here. 8 years ago, at lunchtime, this planet had been demolished, utterly destroyed, by the huge yellow Vogon ships which had hung in the lunchtime sky as if the law of gravity was no more than a local regulation, and breaking it no more than a parking offence. "Delusions," said Russell. "What?" said Arthur, startled out of his train of thought. "She says she suffers from strange delusions, that she's living in the real world. Well, it's no good telling her that she is living in the real world, because she just says that's why the delusions are so strange. Don't know about you, but I find that kind of conversation pretty exhausting. Give her the tablets and piss off for a beer is my answer. I mean, you can only muck about so much, can't you?" "Well, you don't seem to care very much." Arthur tried to say it as matter-of-factly as possible, but it didn't seem to work. "Look, Buster—" "Okay, I'm sorry. It's none of my business. I didn't mean it to sound like that," said Arthur. I know you care a lot, obviously," he added, lying. "I know that you have to deal with it somehow. You'll have to excuse me. I just hitched from the other side of the Horsehead Nebula." He stared furiously out of the window. He was astonished that of all the sensations fighting for room in his head on this night, as he returned to the home that he thought had vanished into oblivion forever, the one that was compelling him was an obsession with this bizarre girl of whom he knew nothing. The storm which had passed them by suddenly erupted again. Lightning belted through the sky, and someone seemed to be pouring something which closely resembled the Atlantic Ocean over them through a sieve. Russell swore, and steered intently for a few seconds as the sky blattered at them. He worked out his anger by rashly accelerating to pass a lorry marked McKenna's All-Weather Haulage. The tension eased as the rain subsided. "It started with all that business of the CIA agent they found in the reservoir when everybody had all their hallucinations and everything, you remember?" Arthur wondered for a moment whether to mention again that he had just hitchhiked back from the other side of the Horsehead Nebula, and was, for this and various other related and astounding reasons, a little out of touch with recent events, but he decided it would only confuse matters further. "No," he said. "Well, that was the moment she cracked up. She was in a caff somewhere, Rickmansworth. Don't know what she was doing there, but that was where she cracked up. Apparently she stood up, calmly announced that she'd undergone some extraordinary revelation or something, wobbled a bit, looked confused, and finally collapsed, screaming, into an egg sandwich." Arthur winced. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said, a little stiffly. Russell made a sort of grumping noise. "So, what was the CIA agent doing in the reservoir?" "Bobbing up and down, of course. He was dead." "Come on, you remember all that stuff, the hallucinations? Everyone said it was a cock-up, the CIA trying experiments in drug warfare or something, some crackpot theory that instead of invading a country, it would be much cheaper and more effective to make everyone think they'd been invaded." "Well, what hallucinations were those exactly?" said Arthur in a rather quiet voice. "What do you mean, what hallucinations? I'm talking about all that stuff with the big yellow ships. Everyone going crazy and saying we're going to die, and then pop, they vanished as the effect wore off. The CIA denied it, which meant it must be true." Arthur's head went a little swimmy. His hand grabbed at something to steady himself and gripped it tightly. His mouth made little opening and closing movements as if it was on his mind to say something, but nothing emerged. "Anyway," continued Russell, "whatever drug it was, it didn't seem to wear off so fast with Fenny. I was all for suing the CIA, but a lawyer friend of mine said it would be like trying to attack a lunatic asylum with a banana." "The Vogon," squeaked Arthur, "I mean, the yellow ships vanished?" "Well, of course they did. They were hallucinations," said Russell, and looked at Arthur oddly. "You trying to say you don't remember any of this? Where have you been, for heaven's sake?" This was, to Arthur, such an astonishingly good question that he half leapt out of his seat with shock. Russell fought to control the car, which was suddenly trying to skid. He pulled it out of the path of an oncoming lorry and swerved up onto a grass bank. As the car lurched to a halt, the girl in the back was thrown against Russell's seat and collapsed. Awkwardly, Arthur twisted round in horror. "Is she all right?" he blurted out. Russell swept his hands angrily back through his blow-dried hair. He tugged at his blonde moustache. He turned to Arthur. "Would you, please," he said, "let go of the handbrake?" From here it was a 4-mile walk to his village, a mile further to the turning, to which the abominable Russell had now fiercely declined to take him, and from there a further 3 miles of winding country lane. The Saab seethed off into the night. Arthur watched it go, as stunned as a man might be who, having believed himself to be totally blind for 5 years, suddenly discovers that he'd been merely wearing too large a hat. He shook his head sharply in the hope that it might dislodge some salient fact which would fall into place and make sense of an otherwise utterly bewildering universe. But since the salient fact, if there was one, entirely failed to do this, he set off up the road again, hoping that a good vigorous walk would help to reassure him of his own existence at least, if not his sanity. It was 10:30 when he arrived, a fact he discovered from the steamed and greasy window of the Horse and Groom pub, in which there had hung for many years a battered old Guinness clock which featured a picture of an emu with a pint glass jammed rather amusingly down its throat. This was the pub at which he had passed the fateful lunchtime, during which first his house and then the entire planet Earth had been demolished, or rather had seemed to be demolished. No, damn it, it had been demolished, because if it hadn't, then where the bloody heck had he been for the last 8 years? And how had he got there, if not in one of the big yellow Vogon ships, which the appalling Russell had just been telling him were merely drug-induced hallucinations? And yet, if it had been demolished, what was he currently standing on? He jammed the brake on this line of thought, because it wasn't going to get him any further than it had the last 20 times he'd been over it. He started again. This was the pub at which he had passed the fateful lunchtime, during which whatever it was had happened, that he was going to sort out later had happened, and it still didn't make sense. He started again. This was a pub. Pubs served drinks, and he couldn't half do with one. Satisfied that his jumbled thought processes had at last arrived at a conclusion, and a conclusion that he was happy with, even if it wasn't the one he had set out to achieve, he strode towards the door. And stopped. A small black wire-haired terrier ran out from behind a low wall and then, catching sight of Arthur, began to snarl. Now, Arthur knew this dog, and he knew it well. It belonged to an advertising friend of his, and was called Know-Nothing Bozo because the way its hair stood up on its head reminded people of the President of the United States of America. And the dog knew Arthur, or at least should do. It was a stupid dog, but it should at least have been able to recognize Arthur instead of standing there, hackles raised, as if Arthur was the most fearful apparition ever to intrude upon its feeble-witted life. This prompted Arthur to go and peer at the window again, this time with an eye not for the asphyxiating emu, but for himself. Seeing himself for the first time suddenly in a familiar context, he had to admit that the dog had a point. He looked a lot like something a farmer would use to scare birds with, and there was no doubt but that to go into the pub in his present condition would excite comment of a raucous kind, and worse still, there would doubtless be several people in there at the moment whom he knew, all of whom would be bound to bombard him with questions which, at the moment, he felt ill-equipped to deal with. Will Smithers, for instance, the owner of Know-Nothing Bozo, the non-wonder dog, an animal so stupid that it had been sacked from one of Will's own commercials for being incapable of knowing which dog food it was supposed to prefer, despite the fact that the meat in all the other bowls had had engine oil poured over it. Will would definitely be in there. Here was his dog, there was his car, a grey Porsche 928S with a sign in the back window which read, "My other car is also a Porsche." Damn him. He stared at it and realized that he had just learnt something he hadn't known before. Will Smithers, like most of the overpaid and under-scrupulous bastards Arthur knew in advertising, made a point of changing his car every August so that he could tell people his accountant made him do it, though the truth was that his accountant was trying like hell to stop him, what with all the alimony he had to pay and so on, and this was the same car Arthur remembered him having before. The number plate proclaimed its year. Given that it was now winter, and that the event which had caused Arthur so much trouble 8 of his personal years ago had occurred at the beginning of September, less than 6 or 7 months could have passed here. He was suddenly stunned by a realization he could no longer avoid. Try as they might, no one was even going to be able to believe his story. Not only did it sound perfectly potty, but it was flatly contradicted by the simplest observable facts. Was this really the Earth? Was there the slightest possibility that he had made some extraordinary mistake? The pub in front of him was unbearably familiar to him in every detail, every brick, every piece of peeling paint, and inside he could sense its familiar, stuffy, noisy warmth, its exposed beams, its unauthentic cast-iron light fittings, its bar sticky with beer that people he knew had put their elbows in. The bar was overlooked by cardboard cutouts of girls with packets of peanuts stapled all over their breasts. It was all the stuff of his home, his world. He even knew this blasted dog. The door of the pub opened and Will Smithers came out, wearing a leather flying jacket that he got a mate of his at the Road Research Laboratory to crash a car into specially in order to get that battered look. Know-Nothing yelped with delight, and having got the attention it wanted, was happy to forget Arthur. Will was with some friends, and they had a game they played with the dog. "Commies!" they all shouted at the dog in chorus. "Commies! Commies! Commies!" The dog went berserk with barking, prancing up and down, yapping its little heart out beside itself in transports of ecstatic rage. They all laughed and cheered it on, then gradually dispersed to their various cars and disappeared into the night. Well, that clears one thing up, thought Arthur. This is quite definitely the planet I remember. His house was still there. How or why, he had no idea. He had decided to go and have a look while he was waiting for the pub to empty, so that he could go and ask the landlord for a bed for the night when everyone else had gone. And there it was. He let himself in with a key he kept under a stone frog in the garden. The door had to be forced open because of the astonishing accumulation of junk mail on the doormat. It jammed itself stuck on what he would later discover were 14 identical personally addressed invitations to apply for a credit card he already had, 17 identical threatening letters for non-payment of bills on a credit card he didn't have, 33 identical letters saying that he personally had been specially selected as a man of taste and discrimination who knew what he wanted and where he was going in today's sophisticated jet-setting world, and would he therefore like to buy some grotty wallet. He rammed himself through the relatively narrow opening afforded by all this and blundered up the dark stairs to his bedroom. He collapsed onto his cold, musty-smelling bed and for a few minutes stopped trying to prevent the world from spinning round his head in the way it obviously wanted to. When it had enjoyed its little spin and had calmed down a bit, Arthur reached out for the bedside light, not expecting it to come on. To his surprise, it did. This appealed to Arthur's sense of logic. Since the electricity board cut him off without fail every time he paid his bill, it seemed only reasonable that they should leave him connected when he didn't. Sending the money obviously only drew attention to yourself. The room was much as he had left it, i.e. festeringly untidy, though the effect was muted a little by a thick layer of dust. There was only one thing in the room that was different. For a moment or so he couldn't see what the one thing that was different was, because it was too covered in a film of disgusting dust. Then his eyes caught it and stopped. It was next to a battered old television on which it was only possible to watch Open University study courses, because if it tried to show anything more exciting, it would break down. It was a box. Arthur pushed himself up on his elbows and peered at it. It was a cubic grey box, just over a foot on a side. It was tied with a single grey ribbon knotted into a neat bow on the top. He got up, walked over, and touched it in surprise. Whatever it was clearly gift-wrapped, neatly and beautifully, and was waiting for him to open it. Cautiously, he brushed the dust off the top and loosened the ribbon. The top of the box was a lid, with a flap tucked into the body of the box. He untucked it and looked into the box. In it was a glass globe, nestling in a fine grey tissue paper. He drew it out carefully. It wasn't a proper globe, because it was open at the bottom, or, as Arthur realized, turning it over at the top with a thick rim, it was a bowl, a fish bowl. It was made of the most wonderful glass, perfectly transparent, yet with an extraordinary silver-grey quality, as if crystal and slate had gone into its making. Arthur slowly turned it over and over in his hands. It was one of the most beautiful objects he had ever seen, but he was entirely perplexed by it. He looked into the box, but other than the tissue paper there was nothing. On the outside of the box there was nothing. He turned the bowl round again. It was wonderful. It was exquisite. But it was a fish bowl. He tapped it with his thumbnail, and it rang with a deep and glorious chime which was sustained for longer than seemed possible, and when at last it faded, seemed not to die away, but to drift off into other worlds, as into a deep-sea dream. Entranced, Arthur turned it round yet again, and this time the light from the dusty little bedside lamp caught it at a different angle and glittered on some fine abrasions on the fish-bowl's surface. He held it up, adjusting the angle to the light, and suddenly saw clearly the finely engraved shapes of words shadowed on a glass. "So long," they said, "and thanks for all the fish." And that was all. For fully 5 more minutes he turned the object round and around, held it to the light at different angles, tapped it for its mesmerizing chime, and pondered on the meaning of the shadowy letters, but could find none. Finally he put it on the table next to the television. He returned to lie on his bed, and turned out the light. He lay still and quiet. He absorbed the enveloping darkness, slowly relaxed his limbs from end to end, eased and regulated his breathing, gradually cleared his mind of all thought, closed his eyes, and was completely incapable of getting to sleep. The night was uneasy with rain. The rain clouds themselves had now moved on and were currently concentrating their attention on a small transport cafe just outside Bournemouth. The moon was out in a watery way. It looked like a ball of paper from the back pocket of jeans that have just come out of the washing machine, and which only time and ironing would tell if it was an old shopping list or a £5 note. A bell somewhere chimed midnight. A skylight creaked open. It was stiff and had to be jiggled and persuaded a little, because the frame was slightly rotten, and the hinge had at some time in its life been rather sensibly painted over, but eventually it was open. A strut was found to prop it, and a figure struggled out into the narrow gully between the opposing pitches of the roof. It stood and watched the sky in silence. The figure was completely unrecognizable as the wild-looking creature who had burst crazily into the cottage a little over an hour ago. Gone was the ragged, threadbare dressing-gown, smeared with the mud of 100 worlds. Gone was the tangled mane of hair. Gone the long and knotted beard, flourishing ecosystem and all. Instead, there was Arthur Dent, the smooth and casual, in corduroys and a chunky sweater. His hair was cropped and washed, his chin clean-shaven. The night seemed like an alive thing to him at this moment, the dark earth around him a being in which he was rooted. He could feel, like a tingle on distant nerve ends, the flood of a far river, the roll of invisible hills, the knot of heavy rain clouds parked somewhere away to the south. He let his mind drift outward sleepily in developing ripples. It felt the presence of other minds. Hundreds of them, thousands in a web, some sleepy, some sleeping, some terribly excited, one fractured. One fractured. He passed it fleetingly and tried to feel for it again, but it eluded him like the other card with an apple on it in Pelmanism. He felt a spasm of excitement because he knew instinctively who it was, or at least knew who it was he wanted it to be. He instinctively knew that it was Fanny, and that he wanted to find her, but he could not. By straining too much for it, he could feel he was losing this strange new faculty, so he relaxed the search and let his mind wander more easily once more. And again he felt the fracture. Again he couldn't find it. This time, whatever his instinct was busy telling him it was all right to believe, he wasn't certain that it was Fanny. Or perhaps it was a different fracture this time. It had the same disjointed quality, but it seemed a more general feeling of fracture, deeper, not a single mind, maybe not a mind at all. He let his mind sink slowly and widely into the earth, rippling, seeping, sinking. He was following the earth through its days, drifting with the rhythms of its myriad pulses, seeping through the webs of its life, swelling with its tides. Always the fracture kept returning, a dull, disjointed, distant ache. And now he was flying through a land of light. The light was time, the tides of it were days receding. The fracture he had sensed, the second fracture, lay in the distance before him across the land, the thickness of a single hair across the dreaming landscape of the days of earth. And suddenly he was upon it. He danced dizzily over the edge as the dreamland dropped sheer away beneath him, a stupefying precipice into nothing, him wildly twisting, clawing, flailing in horrifying space, spinning, falling. Across the jagged chasm had been another land, another time, an older world, not fractured from, but hardly joined. Two earths. He woke. A cold breeze brushed the feverish sweat standing on his forehead. The nightmare was spent, and so, he felt, was he. His shoulders dropped. He gently rubbed his eyes with the tips of his fingers. At last he was sleepy as well as very tired. As to what it meant, if it meant anything at all, he would think about it in the morning, for now he would go to bed and sleep. He could see his house in the distance, silhouetted against the moonlight, and he wondered why this was. He looked about him and noticed that he was about 18 inches above some rose bushes. He wondered what was holding him there, and when he discovered that nothing was holding him there, he crashed awkwardly to the ground. He picked himself up, brushed himself down, and hobbled back to his house. He undressed and toppled into bed. Arthur awoke feeling wonderful, absolutely fabulous, refreshed, overjoyed to be home, bouncing with energy. He was hardly disappointed at all to discover it was the middle of February. He almost danced to the fridge, found the 3 least hairy things in it, put them on a plate, and watched them intently for 2 minutes. Since they made no attempt to move within that time, he called them breakfast and ate them. Between them, they killed a virulent space disease he'd picked up without knowing it in the Phlargathon gas swamps a few days earlier, which otherwise would have killed off half the population of the Western Hemisphere, blinded the other half, and driven everyone else psychotic and sterile. So the Earth was lucky there. He unpacked his towel and another few odd bits and pieces from the plastic bag he'd acquired at the Port Brasta mega market. The bag had a hole in it, so he threw it away. He realized with a sudden twinge that something must have dropped out in the small spacecraft that had brought him to Earth, kindly going out of its way to drop him right beside the A303. He had lost his battered and space-worn copy of the thing which had helped him find his way across the unbelievable wastes of space he had traversed. He had lost the Hitch-hiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Well, he told himself, I really won't be needing it again. He flipped through the yellow pages and made a short list of numbers to try. Oh, hello, is that the Old Elms Hospital? Yes, I was just phoning to see if I could have a word with Fenella. Fenella? Oh, good Lord, silly me, I'll forget my own name next. Fenella, oh, isn't this ridiculous? Patient of yours, dark-haired girl, came in last night. I'm afraid we don't have any patients called Fenella. Oh, don't you? I meant Fiona, of course. We just call her I'm sorry. Goodbye. Click. 6 conversations along these lines began to take their toll on his mood of vigorous, dynamic optimism, and he decided that before it deserted him entirely, he would take it down to the pub and parade it a little. He whistled to himself as he pushed open the door which had so daunted him last night. He had had the perfect idea for explaining away every inexplicable weirdness about himself at a stroke. He grinned cheerfully at the boggling eyes that stared at him from all corners of the pub, and told them all what a wonderful time he'd had in Southern California. 2 hours later, he said as he accepted another pint, Of course, I had my own personal alchemist, too. You what? He was getting silly, and he knew it. Oh, yes, he insisted with a happy, glazed smile. It's why I've lost so much weight. What? Said his audience. Oh, yes, he said again. The Californians have rediscovered alchemy. Only it's in a much more useful form than that which He paused thoughtfully to let a little grammar assemble in his head. In which the ancients used to practice it. Or at least, he added, failed to practice it. They couldn't get it to work, you know, Nostradamus and that lot. Couldn't cut it. Nostradamus? Said one of his audience. Well, I didn't think he was an alchemist, said another. I thought, said a third, he was a seer. Oh, he became a seer, said Arthur to his audience, the component parts of which were beginning to bob and blur a little, because he was such a lousy alchemist. You should know that. He took another pull at his beer. It was something he had not tasted for 8 years. Well, what has alchemy got to do with losing weight? Asked a bit of the audience. I'm glad you asked that, said Arthur, very glad, and I will now tell you what the connection is between those two things.